Welcome everyone. Welcome to the first year's episode of Unsavory Politik. I am your host, Jamar Jabari, who is also the host of Jabari Vok Podcast. And this is a segment, a part of the Jabari Vok Podcast, where we talk about very, very important issues. And I want to talk about Venezuela today, and we're going to talk about Alex Saab's case. We're going to get into a little bit about U.S. imperialism as well too. And before I introduce my guest, I want to play this amazing video, amazing speech that he gave, and I hope a lot of people are inspired by this speech just as much as I was.
Welcome up Alex Suarez of Revolutionary Alliance. Uhuru. Here he comes. And we are getting ready to start marching, so we want to remind everybody to get your flags and go ahead and get in place. So just want to put that out there. Uhuru, Alex. There you go.
My name is Alex Suarez, and I'm here today to express my utmost support and solidarity with the Uhuru movement, its leadership, its courage, and its example to us all. As a Latino and a son of an immigrant who proudly bears indigenous blood, I believe the solidarity and unity among our people, black and brown, as well as the other so-called minorities, red, yellow, etc., is essential to this fight as a vanguard working on behalf of the plight of the oppressed. I say so-called, as I laid out in my speech in St. Augustine, Florida, a state where people of mixed Seminole and black background defeated the U.S. Army in 3 wars, largely covered up. The day after being tear-gassed in Jacksonville for peacefully protesting for Black lives 3.5 years ago, as we saw in much of the country, I stressed we colonized people are in actuality a majority of the world population. Indeed, when Trump has used the slogan, Make America Great Again, to us, this has meant Make America White Again. Many of the Republicans themselves have used this latter slogan, and the betrayal from the Democrats on our people we have felt deeply as well. The fear of, in a couple generations, the colonized people being majority, along with ideological unity, while the white population then being a minority, scares the bourgeois whites who ultimately control Washington. Where better to express this than the imperial capital of the U.S.? We see an abundance of architecture in the Greco-Romano styles of the ancient empires here. We are in the belly of the beast, where we have vast economic inequality, where just a few steps from the Senate is mass homelessness and houselessness and poverty we see at the level of the so-called third world. Where even in much of that so-called third world, there are better programs to uplift those people. I am here today, comrades, brothers and sisters, to share a vision, not a quixotic dream, but a vision based on realism.
Peace, Alex Suarez. You said that you weren't able to hear the video.
Yeah, since I couldn't hear it that well, I don't know if the comrades could hear it that well either. And sometimes when you add the subtitles, it doesn't really exactly convey what was said either. What I can do now is look up on my blog the text of the speech that I gave at the Black Coalition event of November 4th in D.C. I can go back to the blog and read the speech for everyone so that people can get an idea of my positions, and Alex Saab's mentioned in the speech as well. Do you want me to go ahead and look that up so I can go ahead and read that live?
Yeah, go right ahead.
While I'm looking that up, go ahead and tell people, who I am, some of what I do so they can have a better idea. Save some time.
So, without further ado, I'm sorry about the technical difficulties, ladies and gentlemen. Here is Alex Suarez, who is a historian. Am I saying your name correctly? I want to always make
Yeah,
sure I'm saying
Suarez or Suarez. Better than Suarez. Sometimes they say Suarez or even worse, Suarez. And when they say
Suarez.
Suarez, I'm like, I don't swear that often. It's how a lot of the gringos pronounce it.
But here's activist, writer, and historian. He was also a part of the case with Julian Assange as well too.
Says
And
Alex Saab, yes.
great background over 20 years of activism and being a part of the struggle. So I'm very, very, very very excited to be
Well,
able
I,
to
I
have you
also
on
want
the
to
show.
read before I read the speech my description of an image I have with Chairman O'Malley, a man I admire tremendously.
Yeah, go ahead.
So it says, Chairman O'Malley and myself, after he gave his third speech that day and led a march for an hour from Malcolm X Park to the White House with incredible vitality. He's 82. I told our chairman about how my grandpa was born on October 9th, like him. He told me his wife was also born then, and we talked about how that was when we commemorate the death of Che Guevara. He often cites dates in his speeches, such as the fact Malcolm X was born in 25, the same year Marcus Garvey was arrested, and Malcolm's parents were Garveyites. I also found out recently the late, great journalist and Assange supporter John Pilger was born on October 9th. He was 3 years older than the chairman.
Oh wow.
So I can go ahead into the speech now.
Yep.
My name is Alex Suarez, and I'm here today to express my utmost support and solidarity with the Huru movement, its leadership, its courage, its example to us all. As a Latino, a son of an immigrant who proudly bears indigenous blood, I believe the solidarity and unity among our people, black and brown, as well as the other so-called minorities, red, yellow, etc., is essential to this fight as a vanguard working on behalf of the plight of the oppressed, the working class and poor of this imperial nation. I say so-called since, as I laid out in my speech in St. Augustine, Florida, a state where people of mixed Seminole and black background defeated the U.S. Army in 3 wars, largely covered up. The day after being tear gassed in Jacksonville for peacefully protesting for Black lives 3.5 years ago, as we saw in much of the country, I stressed we colonized people are in actuality a majority of the world population. Indeed, when Trump has used the slogan "Make America Great Again," to us this has meant "Make America White Again." Many of the Republicans themselves have used the latter slogan, and the betrayal from the Democrats on our people we have felt deeply as well. The fear of, in a couple of generations, the colonized people being a majority along with ideological unity, while the white population then being a minority, scares the bourgeois whites who ultimately control Washington. Where better to express this than the imperial capital of the U.S.? We see an abundance of architecture in the Greco-Romano styles of the ancient empires here. We are in the belly of the beast, where we have vast economic inequality. Just a few steps from the Senate is mass homelessness and houselessness and poverty we see at the level of the so-called third world. Or even in much of that so-called third world, there are better programs to uplift those people. I'm here today, comrades, brothers and sisters, to share a vision, not a quixotic dream, but a vision based on realism, accompanied by optimism. The forces of reaction, the imperial colonial forces, are losing their grip in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia. Here too in the US, their deception of the masses is failing, which is why they desperately go after the Uhuru 3 with such a weak case and conduct mass censorship here in imperial North America, which includes Canada, also a colonial state. In my 22 years of activism, never have been part of a movement as important as this, with the potential to grow, and as the imperial government attacks us, we respond and become stronger. The youth, the future generations, our hope, our staff, as we continue our revolutionary journey, continue to enter the ranks. Chairman Omali Yeshitela represents among the last of his generation not wiped out or imprisoned simply for demanding the rights of his people and working with groups in order to achieve these goals this past half century. People talk in their history classes of the Panthers, of Malcolm, of King, but what the media ignores is that the struggle is continuing and that the feds are keeping up with their attacks just as the 1960s and 70s and other parts of our history. I have a vision that one day there won't be multiple presidential candidates for revolutionary, semi-revolutionary parties. We must learn how in Latin America the true left rose up and changed the game and united in coalition, all these parties behind one candidate. That they got their act together, put egos to the side, got rid of the infiltrators, and did movement building till they formed a successful campaign. I witnessed this myself two years ago in Venezuela, and when I saw their electoral process firsthand. We must learn from the example of the African rebellions, the Latin American, from much of the so-called third world. We must ask, who are the savages and who are the civilized? What people have acted in a civilized way? Where was the first civilization? We could even get into the very science of where humanity first started. My vision goes beyond unity towards solidarity, the prosecution who persecutes under the guise of the law, conducting lawfare like what was done with Venezuelan diplomat Alex Saab and others who have defied the U.S. empire. has claimed that this movement is divisive. Well, I say Uhuru unites us along with allies against the injustice. It is a movement of love, not hate. It speaks truth to power, not lies. Love being the guiding principle of this revolutionary process in order to open the hearts and minds of future generations. Uhuru, long live the refuge, long live Revolution Alliance, and long live Palestine.
Very, 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 very great speech. I gotta say, I think that this gives you an eye opener on what exactly people on the left stand for. Um, I want to talk about one part of your
By
speech.
the way, what
Of,
they should stand for, right? Because not
yeah,
everybody.
what they
You
should
have you
stand
have
for.
you have the white left opportunists as well. But just in case, the Hulu 3 to this
Yeah.
day, because we were expecting maybe before we went to DC, maybe in
Hmm.
late October, that the motion to dismiss would be decided upon. To this day, all these months later, uh, it's still up in the air.
Mm,
So if the judge ultimately decides against the motion, then they're going to go ahead with the Hulu 3 trial. The Tampa Five, among them who were at the Black Coalition, two of them, that was dismissed. And of course, there was a victory since then in regards to Alex Saab. And I've been pushing Uhuru to support Alex Saab and the chairman and others in the movement in the African People's Socialist Party. I've been
hmm.
advocating for Alex Saab. Uh, but still, we don't have the victory yet of the Hulu 3 because it's a very serious trial. Just so people understand, I didn't get into it in the speech.
Right.
Two of the three, it's ultimately a death sentence because Comrade Penny Hess is in her late 70s. And as I mentioned, the chairman's 82 years old. These sentences that could be up to 15 years, that's essentially a death sentence for two of them. Only Jesse Neville would probably still be alive
Hmm.
at the end of that sentence because he's younger. I believe he's in his 30s. So it's a terrible lawfare, as I described it, that's being conducted here in the United States. For example, people talk about sanctioning bank accounts of diplomats like Alex Saab and how that's terrible, but they would never do it to U.S. citizens. It's
Right.
exactly what they did with the Hulu. Regions Bank closed
Right.
down their bank accounts in cahoots with the imperial government, sanctioning American citizens for a viewpoint, saying that the Russian agents because of a viewpoint on Ukraine during the special military operation. This is what we're facing. But go ahead with your point, comrade.
Yeah, that I mean that whole point with the Ukraine definitely showed exactly how the left was fractured in America. I would say, um, I've seen a lot of which you can share stories as well too on just how fractured the left became as soon as Ukraine became in the conversation. You mentioned also in your speech about Venezuela and how you were able to witness the Venezuelan process. For a quick story, I know another comrade, Carly, who have interviewed multiple times on this show, and who has also been a part of the movement. I learned a lot from her off of her journalism as well too. She has also visited Venezuela. She got hurt while she was in Venezuela, and she went and got looked at a doctor. She went to the doctor and asked the doctor, "Who do I pay for for being treated?" The doctor looked at her and laughed and said, "You Americans, you don't need to pay. It is free. It should be free."
Would have been the same case in Cuba as well, which I've also been to.
Exactly. So I want to give that story for people that don't fully understand the reality of what Venezuela is.
And it's not
Uh,
just a question of if you're a poor Venezuelan,
right,
you get free health care.
right.
When I don't want to call it free public health care, it's not out of pocket. It's guaranteed to all Venezuelan citizens. As a matter of fact, if Venezuela had went into that part of Guyana that's disputed, those
Hmm.
citizens would have benefits than they have now. They're not benefiting at all from the ExxonMobil deal with the regime. Only
Right.
the elites in Guyana are benefiting from that. I mean, I'm sure we can talk about that later in the show. But the Venezuelan system is a socialist system, much like you
Hmm.
see in Cuba and other parts of Latin America, and is done in a democratic way, an extremely democratic way, which I was witness to myself when I went there for the first time in late 2021.
And what was that like? Did they use computers like we did, or did they have the paper system?
Both
Oh
both
wow.
very thorough. So when you go there to the voting booth, they print out how you voted. I believe out
Mm,
of the 50 states in the union here in this imperial nation, only Georgia does something like that.
mm,
So even in battleground states like here in Florida, you don't have a right to a receipt showing how you voted. You don't have an automatic audit. All the things they're doing in Venezuela, and so Um, the Oh yeah, the analogy I like to give is like when you even buy a piece of candy in the capitalist system here, right? You're entitled
Yeah.
to a receipt that shows you pay 50 cents, 75 cents, whatever it was. Prices going up all the time. Like for example, at the Winn-Dixie that I go to, I'm a working class guy. I go to Winn-Dixie, tends to be cheaper.
Right.
They have a lot of 2-for-1 deals. That's a common supermarket here in the South. And just the other day, the canned soda went up 50 cents, 75 cents. But if I bought that canned soda and I asked for a receipt, they have to give it to me.
Right.
I can't do that in Florida if I vote. If I'm
No.
at the voter booth, sorry, sir, it's in the computer. We can't show you how you voted. Pretty easy
Right.
to rig then, right? But in
Right.
Venezuela, they have access to all of that. So who are we to judge, or who is our society or our government to judge how Venezuela conducts their elections when we're having huge electoral problems here? That both the elite-run Democrats and Republicans, who basically have the same foreign policy, both treated Alex Saab terribly, the Biden and the Trump regimes.
Yep.
And then the United States wants to judge how Venezuela conducts their democracy, or cover up the fact that American observers such as myself went down there. Although since I've been joining up with the Hood, I don't call myself American anymore.
Mm.
I'm a Latino, much like Uhuru supporters or members of African descent call themselves Africans of African American. Why add American to the title? Because American is a European in origin. It comes from Amerigo Vespucci, who was an Italian explorer. That doesn't apply to the people with indigenous roots, such as myself. I'm proudly part Inca, who are great people, advanced people. The most spoken language of any indigenous group in the Americas is Quechua, which is the language of the Incas.
Yep.
Which is in several South American countries, including my father's country in Peru. Who liberated? What liberating armies were led by in Peru? Simon Bolivar. I went to his gravesite when I was in Venezuela. Why?
Wow.
Because he was Venezuelan. The
Right.
Venezuelans descend from the liberators that freed us from the Spaniards, and we
Yeah.
owe that debt to Venezuela to be in solidarity
Hmm.
with the Chavista government, with legitimate government, the government of Maduro, that Alex Saab had proudly represented and had defied to the end, resisting torture, physical torture, and never giving in. And for 3.5 years, finally, he was successful in returning to his family, and it was my honor to take a small part in that campaign.
Now let's take it back with his case. When you look in the headlines here in America, what they focus on is money. For instance, they say that he secured millions of dollars for the Venezuelan regime. Who was Alex Saab before the American government targeted him?
By the
And
way, I
what did
was
he
in the
serve?
courtroom and I saw the documents, and basically it was all supposition. That's a legal term,
Hmm.
supposition. That means that you're just guessing. You can't corroborate it with actual physical evidence. There was
Right.
no evidence that he had these bank accounts that they're talking
Oh, it was
about.
definitely
Matter of fact,
overblown.
the Swiss, it's important to understand, the Swiss did their own investigation, because a
Right.
lot of people put money in Swiss bank accounts, and they said Alex Saab has no bank account in this country. They
Yeah.
found out that it was all false. This is before he was captured in June of
Jesus.
2020 during the
Wow.
Trump regime, when he was in Cape Verde, en route, for those who are not familiar with the case, to
Right.
Iran, who were allied with Venezuela. I found out later that he actually helped to contract 5. I mean, the Venezuelan government paid for it, but he used his connections in the Middle East, his diplomatic immunity at the time, which was later
Hmm.
violated by the United States, to contract 5 Iranian vessels. But I remember when this happened, the United States went into international waters in an act of piracy. You want to talk about Yemenese pirates? The real pirates of the United States. They went into
Yeah.
international waters and captured 3 out of 5 of the vessels and
Yep.
stole the oil that was
I remember
purchased
reading about
by
that.
Venezuela. The British stole the Venezuelan gold. They still haven't returned it.
Yep.
They were trying to give it to Guaido, the puppet who stole millions from the Venezuelan people, and
They
fled to
stole over
Miami.
$1 billion
Now
in
he's
gold, right?
considered an academic or something. I don't know what credentials he has for that. Although he was
Yeah.
educated in the United States, they say he was groomed from day one. He went to George Washington University, I believe.
Yeah. Well, he
And
was
so,
CIA groomed as well too.
well, yeah, because the George Washington University, I've been there. We had an event there in D.C., and that's down the street from the State Department.
Right.
And everybody knows the State Department's heavily infiltrated by the CIA. They use it to recruit
Right.
students early on, including immigrant students like Guaido, who speaks perfect English. He pretends he doesn't. He does.
Yep. Yep.
And so, um, you know, but still, it was an incredible victory that 2 Iranian vessels was in 2020, at the height of COVID, when they kidnapped him, were able to get to Venezuelan shores. And so I want to be chronological here. He's en route to Venezuela. I'm sorry, he's en route to Iran from Venezuela. He's why does he end up in Cape Verde off the coast of Africa? Because he's trying to refuel his jet, his diplomatic jet. It's interesting because usually they would land in Algeria and then from there go on to Iran. It's not the first time he went to Tehran.
And he was a diplomat, just to make sure.
I'm sorry?
He was a Saab was a diplomat.
Since 2018, I'll mention why that year is important in a minute. But
okay,
when he was in Algeria, when he was in Algerian airspace, for some reason, probably on U.S. orders, they ordered him to go back. And so they needed to refuel. So Cape Verde was all set up already. Immediately, as soon as they arrived in the airport, they boarded the plane, they captured him without an Interpol notice, completely legally, just on orders from the Trump regime. And so they tortured him. These are U.S. agents on strict U.S. orders. And he did not give in. He was tortured for at least 5 months straight. That was the physical torture. The psychological torture was later, the denial of his cancer medication. It's amazing he survived.
Wow.
And so, yeah, because he was in remission from stomach cancer, but that can come back if you don't take your meds. So it's incredible he survived that. They didn't get the cancer back that we know. But his teeth were, he said he's just now going to see a dentist in Venezuela. His teeth were knocked out. And what were they trying to do? They were trying to get 2 pieces of information from him that he never gave in for. And by the way, the reason why it was 5 months is because there was a change of presidents. And not to say anything good about Biden, but Biden stopped the torture and they tortured him a different way, psychological. And they brought him to Miami instead of freeing him on the trumped up charge. But they were trying to get information.
Jesus
What's
Christ.
that?
I'm like, wow, Biden just switches the torture to psychological. Like,
that's
that's
the different kind of Republican. They're going to torture you in a different way. Same foreign policy, right? And psychological is bad too. It can be just as bad as physical. We know that. Look at Assange. They destroyed Assange psychologically with torture against him, which have been even longer than Alex Saab. But we'll get into that if you like. But they're holding him there. They're trying to find out 2 pieces of information. They want him to give away the routes of those ships, and not just the Iranian ships, but all the different vessels from all over the world he was able to get together to defy U.S. sanctions so that not as many people died. By the way, still a lot of people died. The UN determined, the rapporteurs investigated and determined, led by Manuel Zelaya, a very respected UN rapporteur. For people that want to Google it, Zelaya is spelled D-E space Z-A-Y-A. I believe his first name is Manuel. Yeah, it is Manuel. One time I called him Zelaya by accident because there's a Honduran president that was Manuel Zelaya, but it's Manuel de Zelaya. So, anyways, according to his report that he oversaw, as of 2020, since the sanctions were implemented by Trump in only 1 year's time, about 2019 to 2020, those sanctions killed 100,000 Venezuelans.
Yeah.
So you could imagine 2019, 2020, all the way up to finally Biden, he didn't completely lift the sanctions, partial lifting. 100,000 people a year. And if you just look at the 100,000 figure, let's look at per capita, right? That's the equivalent with the U.S. population, because there's only 28 million people in Venezuela now. That's the equivalent of killing 30 million Americans. And 30 million is the approximate amount of Soviets that sacrificed their lives from the Nazi onslaught more than any other nation in World War II. Just to give you that sacrifice. And the numbers are higher. I'm just saying that portion that was looked at. But that 100,000 could have been a million if that was not for Alex Saab. Because he saved so many lives. It's incalculable. We don't even know the thousands of lives that he saved. Because the CLAP program, which is like the equivalent of our food stamp or EBT program here in the United States, that was started by Alex Saab. That food, those medicines, those syringes, the fuel from Iran and other countries that came in, that was because of Alex Saab. And the U.S. knew it, and they were infuriated and wanted to find a way to get him, even though he was a diplomat. So for the act of diplomacy, for the act of doing a good job of fighting illegal U.S. sanctions, what the UN said were illegal, unilateral coercive measures, not a way to put it, or economic warfare. Because you say sanctions, sounds like a surgical procedure. It doesn't sound something that serious. But it's economic war, guerra económica, as you would say in Spanish. And so the unilateral coercive measures, what was I going to say about that? I mean, it's a form of genocide, really, if you think about it, and how it's implemented against other countries. Hasn't hurt Russia as bad, but it's hurt Iran and other countries in the third world. And so Iran has been allied with Venezuela. They have a common enemy in the U.S. empire. And so, it's incalculable how many lives that he ended up saving. But it was beautiful to be able to see Maduro stand alongside him in Caracas and say, the whole time you were tortured and held in Cape Verde, all the supplies, the routes that you established, still got to Venezuela.
That's amazing.
Right? But even before he was captured, I just want to make this important point. 3 out of the 5 vessels that he acquired from Iran were captured in international waters. This is the cruelty of the United States at the height of the COVID, and also Cuba, allied with Venezuela. The United States said, we'll stop doing this to you, Cuba, if you stop allying with Maduro. And it made them solidify even more and defiant against the U empire because they're socialists, they're anti-imperialists.
Right.
So they stopped syringes from coming into Cuba. And then they invented their own vaccines. This is the resourcefulness of the Cubans. It's nothing new. Look at the special period in the 1990s when they lost the support of the Soviet Union because of their fall.
Right.
They invented a lung cancer vaccine that we Americans don't have access to. That's why if you're a Cuban and you smoke a cigar, you never get lung cancer. They live longer than us.
And in fact, if you are American and you're caught going there to get
to things that Cubans have that we don't have. And so it's ridiculous.
I was going to say, if I read an article, if you're American and you caught in Cuba getting that vaccine, you could be charged for treason.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
and I'm not surprised by that at all. I'm not surprised by that at all because they want to prevent American citizens from going to Venezuela, the imperial government. They want to prevent American citizens from going to Cuba. Why is this? Because they do consider them a threat. You remember during the Obama administration, he was a little more diplomatic than Biden or Trump, but he made a lot of mistakes as well, or terrible policies. And one of his terrible policies that he did, that he promised to Maduro he was going to reverse, he didn't. We know about this now. Maduro's been talking about it since Alex Saab came back.
Oh yeah,
yes, it's been very interesting stuff to reveal that Maduro's revealing it since Alex Saab came back that he held back before because he thought it might sabotage his diplomat from coming back. But he said Obama told him to his face it was a mistake. He was going to reverse it. But when Obama made, I believe it was a directive, it was like a mandate from the White House that Venezuela was existential or some type of security threat to the United States. At that time, every country from south of the Rio Grande to the tip of Argentina, including conservative or centrist governments, because they were pressured by their populations, condemned Washington for saying that Venezuela was a security threat, because that could be used later to justify further sanctions, which it did, or even possibly military invasion. They sent mercenaries. Among those mercenaries were Americans that were returned to the United States in exchange for Alex Saab, because Drew was a reasonable man, and that was the dialogue, and that was the deal that was reached.
People have to look that up, by the way, because some people.
Yeah, so that directive. When that came out, I said that Obama was right, and everybody was in shock. And they were like, "What do you mean Obama's right? You support Venezuela? Aren't you with the Chavistas?" I said, "He's right. They're a threat to the American way of life." I said, "What are you talking about? What better way to destroy the myth of capitalism than to have a truly socialist system that in 1999 installed Hugo Chavez, that completely transformed the economy in the oppressed nations within Venezuela?" To show that system to working class and poor Americans, especially of oppressed nation backgrounds, is an incredible threat to the imperialists. Absolutely. It's not a security threat.
You're showing them the right way of doing things.
To the capitalist way of life. And in that way, Obama's right. I was being sarcastic, but I was also being truthful that, yes, they are a threat, but in that regard.
Right. No, I agree. So how did Qatar get into this situation?
So Qatar's an interesting case. So I don't like monarchies, but I would say Qatar is probably the best monarchy that's on the globe right now. And I'll tell you why.
A lot of liberals will be mad at you said that.
Well, I'm just going to tell you why they're the best. I'm not saying I support them. I'm saying they're the best among the worst. The Qataris, which Bush II used to call gutter. How does gutter sound like Qatar? Qatar sounds like cigar. That's just stupid. Other people started parroting him. Oh yeah, the guttery government. It's not a guttery government. It's not in the gutter. It's Qatar. So the Qataris. That's interesting. So they were the first Persian Gulf country to withdraw from the coalition of the Yemeni operation. It was the beginning of the end. You can either say Yemeni or Yemenis. It's both correct. But yeah, so the Yemeni operation, the Saudi-led, U.S.-backed genocide, really, of the Yemeni people, or incredible people standing up for Palestine right now in the Red Sea. When the Qataris withdrew from that, it was the beginning of the end of that coalition, fell apart. And as a result, like Al Jazeera, which is a Qatari-run network, media organization,
Mm-hmm.
it was banned from Saudi Arabia. You couldn't watch it in Saudi Arabia. And there was very big tensions, diplomatic tensions between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. Because of those tensions, Qatar started looking towards other allies or building allies, including with Venezuela. You have to understand, Venezuela doesn't necessarily agree with the ideology of Turkey or Qatar or anything like that, or even Iran, right? But they're in alliance with them because they have a common enemy. So it's not a political alliance. I'd say it's an economic alliance. They're making deals. They're helping each other out.
Like China and Russia.
Yeah, like China and Russia, because Russia's not socialist like China has. China has at least a semi-socialist economy, although there's a progressive economy in Russia, you could say.
Right.
Far more than what Yeltsin was trying to do, privatizing everything, right?
Right.
What Putin's doing. So in that regard, the fact that they're no longer in cahoots with the Saudis, and they're no longer in cahoots with the West, and they're having a friendly relationship with Iran, a friendly relationship with Venezuela, I think is a positive. It's a good thing. As a matter of fact, now even the Saudis are starting to do business with the Russians. And so is the Indians. Modi's a right winger. And when Pakistan was doing it, though, because the United States is used for Pakistan to be a client regime, they did a coup against Imran Khan. And Imran Khan, you might not know, when Assange was
covering that,
he had a show on RT.
Yep.
At that time, when Khan was running, I believe his first time for prime minister, he was like second place. Assange interviewed him. And the reason why Assange agreed to have him on is because Assange, through WikiLeaks, found out, and Khan would love this, that he was the only candidate who wasn't corrupt. They looked into all the candidates, and he was the only one that didn't have any dirt. And so he became prime minister later on. He's a pretty good guy, pretty progressive.
Yeah.
But he would stood up to the West and said, no, I'm going to do business with Putin. And then they did the parliamentary coup, which was terrible. But, the United States doesn't see India like Pakistan. They don't see India as much as a client regime, nor do the Saudis. But it's unfortunate that's what happened in Pakistan. Libya, for example, right? I like to get into the international aspect, especially in regards to Africa. I'm a pan-Latin Americanist, but I also believe in Pan-Africanism. And by the way, in Latin America, they call themselves Pan-Americanists because automatically America for them is Latin America. But you have to say the United States pan to Latin America so they understand better what you mean as an international. Right. But in Libya, for example, they recently had said, not just Malaysia, right? Malaysia was inspired by Yemen and almost immediately after blocked Israelis from going to their ports over the genocide in Gaza.
Right.
Something similar today, at least one of the governments. There's two parallel governments in Libya. But I said in response to that on Twitter, did you see my response to that?
No. Could you
I'm happy to repeat what I said. So what I tweeted, I said, if Saif al-Islam, and I met a cousin of Saif al-Islam while in Venezuela. He was one of the observers because Libya's, the Gaddafis were very close with Chavez.
Yeah.
So Saif al-Islam, I said, the son of Muammar Gaddafi, who's in hiding in Libya. I said, if he runs a presidential elections like he tried to before, he'll win. And then Libya will be even more pro-Palestine. You might not remember. I'm a little older. I'm 39. Back when his father was in power, Saif al-Islam took part in a flotilla. Not just a Turkish flotilla, the famous IHH for Turkish flotilla where there was a massacre in international waters. Remember that?
Yeah.
After that happened, Libya sent their own flotilla, and Saif al-Islam was on board. He wasn't shot, but the Israelis sent him back. But Libya has a history of being pro-Palestine, and that goes back to Nasser of Egypt, who helped install Gaddafi, and not as a client regime, but as an alliance. Fellow socialists, Gaddafi, Nasser, Pan-Africanists, Pan-Arabists working together.
That's beautiful.
Was a big admirer of Gaddafi, great Egyptian socialist.
Nasser was Egyptian socialist. Right? Well, you just said it.
of Nasser's legacy, and then of course the NATO operation in 2011 in Libya was a complete disaster. And at that time, Hillary, not to praise Biden by any means, but Hillary was to the right of Biden. He actually was against going into Libya. Although Biden was in favor of going into Iraq, he says he regrets it.
Of course,
that's the position that he took.
Right, of course. So I got understanding of how Qatar got into it. I just didn't understand. I felt like it was random, but that just means that I don't know that much about Qatar.
No, it
So
wasn't
that means
random. Qatar had been having good relations with Venezuela since it ruptured relations a few years
right.
ago with Saudi Arabia. So I wasn't surprised they were involved in the dialogue. They're also involved in helping Hamas fighters out, taking some of their leadership, helping in
Yeah.
negotiations. I don't call them hostages, helping in negotiation with the prisoners of war that are held in Gaza. You see, it's important that we're careful about the language that we use. We don't acquire the language of the imperialists. You change your language, you change your thinking, right? I'll give you an example. I do not call them hostages, not because I don't feel sympathy for them. Some of them were civilians. It's because it's a war. They want to define it as a war, then fine. They're prisoners of war. But I would say it's a genocidal war. It's not a normal war where you have both sides having equal arms. Hamas is not an official army. They don't have near as many weapons as Israel. But when it comes to hand-to-hand combat, they're kicking Israel's butt. They will in Lebanon with Hezbollah. Why is that? Because the Israelis are cowards. The Zionists are used to bombing babies, bombing churches, bombing mosques. When it actually comes acting like men and fighting hand-to-hand combat, they're usually on the run.
Right.
They usually have to rely on snipers from a distance. And actually, one of the first snipers they sent into Gaza since October 7th was Netanyahu's nephew, who was killed because Hamas were able to find him before he could kill more civilians.
Oh, wow.
But that's what they target. The snipers target press with press on them.
Right.
Like they're targeting civilians. They don't know who's Hamas, who's not. They don't care. They're there to commit a genocide, to do a transfer of population, ethnic cleansing.
Yeah, and this is something that they did before in Lebanon for people that that don't know the history. Like this isn't a new tactic that the IDF is doing. This is just being rebranded.
Well, it's Hannibal Directive 2.0. So, are you familiar with that term, Hannibal Directive? Speaking of directives,
yeah, is that referring to the law where if they have a civilian captive that
I would call it super official
Israeli?
Law. Super official law means it's not official.
Okay,
but it's still implemented.
Okay.
So it's para official or super official, whatever term you want to use. It's from Latin law. So I would say it's a 2.0, at least para official law now in the military code of Israel, because there's secret laws as well.
Right.
It used to only apply to Israeli soldiers that were captured by Hamas or other militants. Right. Now it's clearly involving civilians, not only because they use tanks and aerial bombardments of Israeli civilians on October 7th. We know that now.
Yeah.
But they've killed civilians that were Israelis, redheaded, no clothes on, speaking perfect Hebrew with their hands up, shot them
waving
once,
white flag.
knew they were Israeli, went there and shot them again, make sure they were dead. Because they're following strict orders to kill every civilian possible, including their own people, because they want to say, oh, Hamas killed them.
Yes.
But the thing is that we're in the information age. We're in the internet age. So it comes out that they were speaking Hebrew. They knew who they were, and they still killed them. And they say, oh, fog of war. Bullshit, fog of war.
Take that, John.
I was the father of one of those so-called hostages. And I saw my son in a video with his hands in the air. They shot him once. He could have survived. They went and shot him again in the head. I would say the Israelis just killed my son.
Yep.
And so, yeah, the family members, a lot of those prisoners of war, they're pissed at the Israeli regime now. They're pissed at Netanyahu, who's a corrupt son of a bitch. I hate to swear, but he is. And, hopefully he'll be tried for war crimes and for corruption, which his own people have been trying to triumph for as well. Although there's a conspiracy theory going on I don't necessarily agree with.
What is that?
That this is all a false flag that he cooperated with Hamas on. I don't agree with that. I believe because of his imperial arrogance.
Yeah.
You have to understand Zionism is a form of colonialism, white supremacism, and imperialism. And Che understood that. See, a lot of people don't know this. And Che in 1959, as a diplomat for the Cuban revolutionary government that was just installed, went to visit Nasser's Egypt. And one of the first things he asked him when he arrived in Cairo is, I want to go see the oppressed people of Palestine. Because at that time, Gaza was under Egyptian control. And he went there. There's a photo. Malcolm X also went to Gaza. There's no photos of that. There is actually a photo of Che in Gaza in 1959. So Che believed that as well. He was an anti-imperialist. He believed Zionism was a form of imperialism. And that was before 1967, but it was, 11 years after the formation of Israel in 1948.
Right.
And so the POWs, it's clear they want to kill as many of them as possible. Also because some of them reveal the truth. They had an older woman come out who was a peace activist, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
And she was one of the first to be released because of Qatari and Egyptian mediation. The Israelis don't care. They don't want their people back. We know that. They don't care about human life.
They just denied a deal earlier for people to understand. They just denied a release deal earlier, like literally 2-3
Oh, they do
days
all the
ago.
time. They've
Yeah.
done multiple times. I've been paying
Yeah.
attention, but there was an older woman that came out in a press conference, and they've hounded her in the press after the poor woman. And I believe it was intentional. She was one of the first to go because Hamas understood she was a civilian. She was an older woman. She had helped Palestinians out before. She's a peace activist. They probably wanted her to get out early, and the Israelis prevented it, right? Because they could have killed her when they're trying to release her. They had to release her to the Egyptian side of the border in Rafah.
Mm.
If they tried to bring her to Araz to the Israeli side, they probably would have killed her. But when she came out in the press conference, she said they treated her with respect. They gave her medicine. They gave her food. And then she was just hounded by the hysterical Zionists after that. Poor woman.
Yeah.
But you know, that's the truth. I mean, you have survivors of October 7th who weren't killed by the Israelis, who said, you know, that they had Hamas fighters in their home temporarily who were fleeing from the Israelis, and they didn't take any of them because they were civilian. And there was different groups, and there was some lack of coordination. So yes, some civilians were taken accidentally. I don't believe that was the intent, but it was a crazy situation. And so they were talking about how they asked permission to have a banana. Like, this is in Hebrew. These are Israeli survivors. They said that he asked me permission if I could please have a banana. They treated me with respect, and they left. They said, "Don't worry, we're Muslims. We're not going to hurt you. You're a civilian," and they left. And so they try to cover up these stories, or the stories of the survivors saying that the Israelis bombed them, other Israelis, even when they were surrendering, when the Hamas fighters were surrendering.
But their stories are all over TikTok.
And also,
They
you see all the
hide
aerial
well.
bombardments. Mint Press has interviewed me once. They're doing great coverage of this.
Uh-huh.
Aerial bombardments of the music festival,
Yeah.
where most of the civilians were killed. They were probably 90% killed by Israelis so far, from what I've seen. And what I don't get is the survivors of the music festival, they're suing the Israeli security forces. I mentioned this on Twitter the other day too. They're suing the Israeli military forces not for murdering them, which we all know is the truth now,
Right.
but for negligence.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
Negligence?
Yeah.
I'm confused here. Like, how is it negligent? You're sending helicopters. What do they call them? Gunships. U.S. Apache helicopter gunships sent to Israel to kill their own people on October 7th to justify this genocide. And you saw them in the air. They know you killed them, but no, you're going to go along with the narrative and just sue them for negligence.
Negligence.
No part of the Zionist contradictions and hypocrisies that we're witnessing, comrade.
There's literally IDF soldiers that have been recorded admitting that they shot their own people. So America can say whatever they want.
There's a difference. There's a difference between
Zionists can say whatever they want.
There's a difference between friendly fire, and I hate that term, but that's what it is. I mean, that's what it's called. There's a difference between friendly fire and intentionally targeting your own people. This is not friendly fire. It flies in the face of the history of the Hannibal Directive. We know that. All the evidence is showing the contrary.
Yep.
And by the way, Alex Saab's father is Lebanese. Was Lebanese. He died from COVID, unfortunately.
That's right. Alex Saab
his mother is Palestinian heritage. They were immigrants from the Middle East that migrated to Colombia, and the son ended up in Venezuela and became part of the Maduro's government. But he has, origins in the Middle East.
Right.
And he did a great job as a diplomat.
Well, let's move on to Guyana and Latin America. So is Guyana still answering to the UK, or are they identified as a independent nation, but still kind of like how Canada has a relationship with the UK still, but they still are independent?
So there was a dialogue, and it was brilliant, the promo you set up, by the way. I loved it because it shows Biden in the middle trying to divide Ali and Maduro, exactly what's happening.
Right.
And also the British are taking part
in that. Thank you.
That divide and conquer. Right, which is the term came up from the imperialist Julius Caesar, who actually was kind of a more benevolent imperialist in comparison to today, but that's another matter. You'd have to look at Michael Parenti's book about that. But, so Ali and Maduro reach a deal. And part of that deal is under no circumstances would a foreign power intervene in the Caribbean or between Guyana and Venezuela. And what happens within days? The British send a battleship, not just to Guyana, they send it to the border region, and in the very region that's being disputed has oil. ExxonMobil's there. It's called Essequibo.
Yep.
And so, they sent a battleship to Essequibo right after this. What message is that sending? And Ali claims that had nothing to do with him. That means he's got no control of his country. Then that means he's still run by the British.
And that's why I asked. Yep.
Let's go
That's
back to
why
the
I
history. We have
asked.
to understand the history.
Yep.
So in 1831, this is a year after the death of Simon Bolivar,
Okay.
who abolished slavery
The liberator.
and who liberated, I'll name all the countries right now, from north to south: Panama, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, named after him. I said Colombia, Venezuela. Was that 7 nations?
Yeah.
All of that was freed by liberating armies in Venezuela under the command of Simon Bolivar. And so
Great man.
Bolivar, one of the first things he did, he got the Haitian support. They said, you will give you support, but you need to end slavery. He said, of course, I'm against slavery anyways. And so he abolished slavery when he got back to Venezuela under lands that are today in Esquivel. That was freed land that belonged to Venezuela. The slaves there were freed by Bolivar. That's just a fact. Nobody can dispute.
Mhm.
So the oligarchs took over in Venezuela. They ousted the liberator. He died in Colombia on the coast in 1830. By 1831, those same oligarchic sellouts and their descendants who fought Chavez, right, who are among the Venezuelan opposition today, the more whiter-skinned, upper-class Venezuelans, right, descendants of the Spaniards. Those oligarchs made a deal with the British to put them back in chains and to give that land away into the colonial project, the slave colony of Guyana in 1831. That's just a fact. Can you hold on 1 second?
Yeah, no problem.
We're back.
Wow. Just understanding the history of that is very, very important, guys. Because I'm learning a lot of. I've been reading about Simone Boulevard, and understanding the history on how these borders were made and the impact that is still till this day. Still to this day, we are suffering from this colonial rule, and it has not changed as much as people think it has. Because if it did, the UK would have never brought their warships towards Venezuela after Guyana has made a deal with Maduro in Venezuela. It's very contradictory. So that's why it's very important to talk about that part, because the media today is talking about 24/7 that Guyana is going to be invaded by Venezuela, that Venezuela wants to steal oil from Guyana, and they don't want to mention the history. They're keeping it black and white. The black and whiteness is that Venezuela, we told the liberals they're corrupt, so we're going to go off of that part and say that Venezuela wants to invade Guyana. So now all of a sudden, Venezuela is seen as a powerful entity, when the whole time they were saying that Venezuela isn't a powerful entity. The whole time they were saying Maduro's government is going to collapse. Maduro's government is weak. But from understanding how powerful Maduro's army is, I mean, it's comparable to Brazil. So knowing that, the contradictories, they're going to say, oh, they're going to go after Guyana. So now all of a sudden, Venezuela is powerful enough to invade the country and take the resources, even though they have literally the largest oil reserves in the entire world. So to make it seem like Venezuela needs oil, when the whole time U.S. imperialism been trying to steal Venezuela's oil, especially under Chavez and now. It's very, very interesting to me.
I'm back, comrade. I had to take that. But yeah, so 1831 is the year that Guyana was formed. In its first few years, there was slavery going on because they put those black people that were brought to Venezuela originally from the Spaniards, that were freed by Bolivar when the Spaniards were kicked out, the Spanish imperialists, they put them back in chains. And so there was, I don't want to name names, I would call her a bourgeois historian who went on a leftist show not too far back and said that she said, quote unquote, used to be part of Venezuela, in quotes. And by the way, she was African. How can you put in quotations a people that were freed? And by the way, I want to stress this: indigenous, mestizo, and black people were fought on the front lines alongside Bolivar to free those people from slavery, to end the Spanish domination in the region. and not only not to thank Venezuela for freeing what is Guyana today, but to say in quotations, what a denial of history. The denial of the thousands of Venezuelans that gave their lives to free Latin America, to end
We have to
slavery.
decolonize.
And so they say, oh, quote unquote, it was part of Venezuela. Do your history. If you're an historian, you know, and you're ignoring that. You're being a bourgeois.
Right.
And you know how many Guyanese people would love to have a social system in their country? Would love to have Venezuelan passports?
What is
There's
the
no
system in
Guyanese that have been
Guyana?
calling for this. Because their system now is a capitalist system. They have a puppet regime run by West Indian elites like Ali. He's not black. He's a West Indian. Those are the elites that were left over by the British to control the country as a continuation of British colonialism in the region. And you think ExxonMobil, that any of that money is going to trickle down from the oil they found there? It serves the elites. It serves the comprador class, the sellout class. You know, that oil would be used in a socialist system to better the Venezuelan economy and better the Essequibo economy had the Venezuelans take over there. Instead, they reached a deal. They did dialogue with Ali. But now Ali's not fulfilling his end of the bargain because he's letting the British send in a battleship.
Right.
Give me a break.
It's
And
very,
this
very
didn't
weird.
fire on Venezuela, but it's symbolic. You understand?
Right.
It's an aggressive diplomacy, sending a terrible message. That's what people don't understand because they don't understand the history. They don't understand the context of what's going on here.
Right. So what is Maduro's response to the Anglo-Saxons setting up shop near his shores?
Very strong response. He said this is a clear violation of our agreement. And Ali's response is very weak. He says, oh, I have no control over what ships they send here. Then you're admitting you're a colony. You're admitting you don't run your own country. Maybe you should call for Venezuela to come help out then. You know what I'm saying?
It's a very weak statement.
Because the prior president, I don't remember his name right now, but the prior president of Guyana was a black man who was progressive, who was negotiating with Maduro, who was prepared to give some of the Essequibo up.
Right.
What happened? The United States backed Ali, 3 years ago now, and put the full weight of their influence behind Ali, and he took over and immediately ruptured negotiations with Venezuela and started doing antagonistic moves. And here we are today. But people don't want to look at the history, just like Ukraine. Unprovoked. It started on 2022. No, it started at least in 2014 with the U.S.-backed coup in Kiev. You have to look at the history. You have to look at the historical context. I'm actually trained as an historian. I'm glad you mentioned I'm a historian. A lot of people don't know that about me. You know, when I went to college, I learned the Chicago Manual of Citation. And so one of my programs was in history. I've also studied communications to do journalism and whatnot. But I don't want to be a journalist in the United States because I want to be successful at what I do. And to be successful at what you do, at least, you know, it's facilitated by selling out, right? And I'll never sell out. So I won't do the journalism route now. I'll do activism. I'll teach history, real history. Like Michael Parenti, who is a great historian I'm inspired by. Like Howard Zinn. I'll go into linguistics. I'll teach Spanish, linguistics, Chomsky, right? Not that I agree with Chomsky and everything, but he's made a lot of contribution to intellectual progress. I've met him before. And so Chomsky was in Venezuela, by the way, met Chavez. Chavez showed Chomsky.
Oh, really?
UN. I remember when this happened. I was living in Spain at the time. And so, you know, a lot of American intellectuals have sought out Chavez and even some celebrities. And I would say Maduro's not as charismatic as Chavez, but he's just as brave as Chavez. He's a great man also. It's no coincidence he was his vice president. That's another thing. So people complain that Maduro became president after Chavez, right? Including Jorge Ramos, who's a fake journalist. Don't get me started on him. But, you know, when Kennedy was killed, even before Jackie Kennedy's blouse was dried of his blood, Johnson was immediately sworn. Remember that infamous picture of Johnson with his hand on the Bible and then poor Jackie still grief-stricken alongside him? And so that didn't happen in Venezuela. And Venezuela, against all odds, while the nation was mourning and didn't want to go out and vote, within a few weeks of Chavez's death, there was an election. And that's how Maduro was elected. In so many ways, they're more democratic than the United States. What hypocrisy, what imperial arrogance to judge how the Venezuelans conduct their democracy and how their diplomats conduct themselves. When our government, it's not even our government, when the imperialist government had took part in kidnapping and torture operations, rendition, what's it called? Extraordinary rendition, whatever the imperial terms they use to justify these methods. These are inquisitorial methods that they did against Alex Saab. And he never gave in. because he was guided by the Bolivarian principles of socialism, of Chavez and Maduro. That's the truth.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, back Maduro was a bus driver.
A man who loves cats. I see the background
anything.
there. A man who loves cats. It makes me think of Lenin, that famous footage of Lenin with the cat in his lap. I love cats.
Yeah, those are my
quick
kids.
analogy, because I like to get off topic a little bit. It's still related.
You're fine.
It's a tangent. So the cats, this is why I hate the Inquisition, right? I lived in Spain for a couple of years. The Inquisition did terrible things. And among the terrible things it did, and it was an Inquisition in France and Germany that was even worse than Spain, by the way. But because it was larger in scope. In Spain, they only went after conversos and moriscos, which was terrible. I'm just saying it wasn't as big in scope. If you were a converso or morisco, it meant that you are a descendant of a former Jew or Muslim that stayed in the country, that didn't flee. And they wanted to make sure that you were still Catholic, so they tortured you sometimes. It was terrible. Made you go through all types of humiliations, made you eat pork. Terrible. But the German and French Inquisitions that I've studied extensively actually went after witchcraft. So if you didn't like your neighbor, just call them a witch and they'll torture them. That's pretty big in scope, isn't it? But anyways, these different Inquisitions that were going on, because at that time, the monarchs were all Catholic. There wasn't Protestants yet. Or even, the Protestants with significant power. It existed. Martin Luther had been out there who started Protestantism. But anyways, this is where I'm going to get into the cats. They killed off all the cats in Western Europe, or virtually all of them. Some of them fled to the hills because they associated with witchcraft. Not just black cats, all color cats.
Jesus
and what do
Christ.
cats do? Cats protect the grain supply. Cats kill off all the rodents. They protect us from disease. They protect our food. And so there's famine. And that's when the so-called Black Plague, which is really the bubonic plague, because Black Plague is a racist term, as you know. That's when the bubonic plague emerged. And while in the Middle East, where they love their cats, they tend to prefer cats to dogs in Egypt or whatnot, like the Cleopatra cats. They were in abundance. Their economies thrived, while Europe, they were going back to the Stone Age because of the religion and killing off of cats. And so I have a lot of respect for cats.
That's deep. I just learned something right now about Spain.
Well, I'll tell you the origin of every word you can think of, brother. Why did they call police pigs? I alluded to it earlier. It goes back 500 years. They first started calling police pigs because of a division of the inquisitorial police in Spain, and they called that division La División de Puerco, which means the pork division. What were they in charge of? Going to the homes of moriscos and conversos and making them eat pork. Hence, pig or police. And who were the first police in this country? They ran around with copper badges. That's why they called them cops. Slave catchers. They were going down to Florida to try to prevent the Seminoles from rescuing runaway slaves that defeated the U.S. in 3 wars, as I mentioned in my speech.
Right.
But they don't want to tell you the origin of that. They don't want to make a Hollywood movie about that, because Hollywood's run by imperialists and Zionists. You know that. They won't show that. You can maybe find an independent documentary on that if you don't like to read. But there's virtually unknown these 3 wars that went down. Yeah.
Yeah. And they were union busters, all that, man. It was very, very. That's why I don't trust them. For people that are listening, I don't trust.
Well, they're like, go to the FBI. They'll protect the black lives. The FBI? Are you kidding me? Have you heard of COINTELPRO? There's COINTELPRO 2.0, 3.0, etc. COINTELPRO. This stuff's still going on, man. Why do you think they're going after Hulu 3? This is a federal case. You know that.
Right. Lastly, before because we're here for an hour. This is a great show, and I hope everyone's listening and learning a lot. We got to talk about Julian Assange case.
Absolutely. I mentioned him earlier. Whatever you need to know about him. Yeah.
So what are the updates towards getting him released? Is there any movement?
I believe the same day that they freed Alex Saab, Stella Assange, the wife of Alex Saab, and I've met the wife of Julian Assange. I met the wife of Alex Saab, but not her yet. I've met other members of Assange's family, though. But Stella Assange came out on Twitter and was congratulating Alex Saab for his freedom and hoping that her husband could be next. And what's interesting is, I think I mentioned to you this before off the air, there is a Spanish jurist named Baltasar Garzon, who was actually, I didn't mention this part to you, he was responsible for making the arrest warrant against Allende when he fled to Margaret Thatcher's Britain.
Okay.
So that fascist Allende, when he had to stay in Britain in exile and couldn't return to Chile, that's because of Baltasar Garzon on behalf of Chilean Spanish nationals that were victims of Pinochet's reign. Nice. And so this same judge got involved in the Assange case as part of his international defense team and an Alex Saab case later on, interestingly enough. But their cases are similar because it has to do with extraterritoriality, right? So extraterritorial extraterritorial boundaries, the U.S. is trying to grab what? Assange for the act of journalism, exposing war crimes done by the U.S. Just as Saab for the act of diplomacy, fighting illegal U.S. sanctions, is being punished as well. And so there are similarities between the two cases. They're trying to extradite him, which is, again, let's not use the imperial terms here, right? It's a kidnapping. It's a kidnapping. They kidnapped Alex Saab on 2 occasions. We know that. And they're trying to kidnap us. They kidnapped Alex Saab on 2 occasions. They're trying to kidnap Assange again by sending him from Britain to the United States. He belongs back in his country in Australia, by the way. We know that. But they're trying to bring him here. And it would essentially be the coup de grace, as they say in French, the final death blow to investigative journalism if he's brought here. That's it. That's it. And they put him in another dungeon. He's in the London dungeon now. They put him in a dungeon in Virginia or wherever they plan to send him, Colorado. I think the trial will be in Virginia. They send him to Colorado, so maximum security prison. And then they'd Epstein him. People talking about Epstein today, the release of the list. They do probably a fake suicide of the guy, or he might even kill himself because of the psychological torture. So we need to prevent him from being brought here. He needs to be returned to Australia with his family, just as Alex Saab was returned. Because Alex Saab was returned, it gives me hope that so will Assange, who I've been supporting for years as well.
Yeah, definitely. Because this is like you said, this is like literally putting a dagger into journalism. And the fact that a president like Joe Biden can just go on stage and talk about how he supports journalism. I remember this speech. Literally saying that we protect our journalists. American journalists are being shot and killed by the IDF. I say nothing about that. We literally somehow grab an Australian journalist just because he made us look bad.
Because of WikiLeaks, under the leadership of Assange, the Arab Spring happened because they showed how the despots were corrupt and they were in charge of the Arab regimes that were under the sphere of the West, and the people rose up as a result.
Right.
And a lot of people don't know that. He didn't try to take credit for it. He didn't come in as the white savior.
Exactly.
That's what a lot of press nations don't understand. They think, Assange trying to take credit for the Arab Spring. No, quite the contrary. But it's just a fact. The WikiLeaks revelations helped the Arab Spring happen. And then what happened? Within months, Indignados happened in Spain. They had their own movement. Then what? Occupy. I took part of that. Right. All of that was thanks, at least in large part, to these WikiLeaks revelations under the leadership of Assange. Nobody can negate that. Nobody can deny that.
Yep. And that goes against the ruling class line. So he's going around pissing off the ruling class. Journalists are not supposed to be friendly with these Fox News.
We're supposed to be adversarial. The journalist is supposed to be adversarial.
Exactly.
That's real journalism.
The politicians should be afraid that there's a journalist in the room. Not go and shake the journalist's hand and go on $2 million cocktail meetings and all this stuff. And how's your kids? Don't ask journalists how's your kids.
You don't ask politicians how your kids as a journalist either. You don't get personal. And also the question of objectivity. Let me tell you, historically speaking, when I was studying history, I love this. The word bias is actually not negative. When it comes to historical linguistics, academically. But when you say bias, of course, in journalism, that's the worst possible thing you can be. But they are all biased. They're pretending to be objective. They're pretending to be neutral. They're pretending to be agnostic, when it's quite the contrary. And so that type of journalism, I don't have any respect for. Adversarial journalism, the real intent of it, keeping the power in check of the government, that type I do respect. But you can be in league with the activism as long as you're honest about it. You say, hey, look,
exactly,
I'm not objective, but here's the evidence.
Right.
What about truth? Right.
Right. Do you think that he'll be able to see his family?
Well, his wife visits him, his children visit him in the dungeon, but that's very limited, right? The real question is, will he be returned to Australia? I really hope he will be this year. I really hope. Because that will be a victory for the movement for transparency. Just as the freedom of Alex Saab is a victory for the movement against sanctions, against imperialism and socialism, showing how a socialist businessman with principles stood up to the U.S. empire and never sold out, and in the end was returned as a hero, as a national hero. Right.
Exactly. And with that, I hope that we can also have that victory also for Julian Assange. I hope Australia gets a backbone, which they probably won't, but it's going to be the people.
It's only recently been advocating for him because ever since the 1970s when the U.S. backed a coup in Australia, they're under their sphere as well. This is a predominantly white country, although there's a largely immigrant like Filipino and of course the indigenous. I mean the Aboriginals they call them.
Right.
But even a largely white country, if it starts to get out of line, the U.S. will do a coup against it as well.
Of course, Ukraine.
It's not just Ukraine. I mean, strategically, Australia is near Asia, it's near Indonesia,
Right.
not far from Malaysia either, actually.
Right.
The next coup could be in Malaysia because Malaysia has been acting independently. They've been rising up against Israel. There could be another war in Yemen. The Saudis are done of killing Yemenis. The Saudis have been doing the right thing lately, actually. They're like, no, we're not going to stop what they're doing in the Red Sea. You deal with it. We don't have the balls to stand up for Palestine, but at least we're going to say we're not going to go fight the Yemenis again. And also, the Yemenis guerrilla are pretty badass. They don't have the weapons the Saudis do, but they were kicking Saudis' ass. That's part of the reason why they withdrew as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, well, before we go, we gotta mention the attack that happened in Iran. It comes off as a coincidence after the terrorist attack that happened in Lebanon, which killed the Hamas.
Not only that, you need to understand what happened in Syria.
Syria.
Yeah. So one of the most closest comrades to Soleimani.
Mm-hmm.
Can't think of his name right now, but Soleimani, of course, everybody knows who that is. Trump assassinated him.
Right.
He was one of the most important Iranian generals that was in Iraq on a peace mission, actually. The same peace mission that China mediated later between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Right. So
they could restore relations and the Saudis would withdraw from Yemen, do the right thing.
Right.
And so this general was killed in Syria. And Lebanon, it wasn't Hezbollah that was targeted. It was something else could have happened since we've been talking, right? There's constantly stuff going on. But I believe you're talking about when the Hamas fighters that are hosted in Lebanon were killed. And they could target them in Qatar next, who knows? But I'm not talking about that. I said you need to look at Syria because Syria, right before this happened, they killed an Iranian general. And then this probably Mossad operation, they killed a number of civilians near the gravesite of Soleimani.
Yes,
probably conducted by the same agents that were in Syria, probably going through the Golan, which is Israeli territory. Well, Israeli occupied territory that borders Syria. It's really Syrian territory.
It's really Syrian. Yep.
Yeah, and so they probably went, through their agents in Golan to assassinate this Iranian general, and then they used their agents in Iran to conduct this other terrorist operation. But I wouldn't be surprised if the hands of the Mossad are all over this, probably with cooperation with the CIA
or ISIS. Do you think?
ISIS are almost non-existent.
ISIS have worked with the IDF before.
Well, it's more than that, right? The Mossad, and the CIA virtually invented ISIS.
Right.
But they're non-existent now because of people like Soleimani and the Russians that went in and defeated them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. See, that's why I wanted clarity on. So, because Iran is conducting this investigation, and I have a feeling that Israel was a part of this.
They're going to retaliate. Yes, and Hezbollah and Iran have a lot more weapons than Hamas.
Yeah.
This is going to escalate pretty quickly. I'm not saying it's going to get to World War III, but it's going to escalate pretty quickly. And finally, the United States is going to have to use its influence to say, Israel, stop the genocide. Because the Yemenis in the Red Sea are going to make commerce impossible. And all these other regional escalation, the United States is going to have to, in its own imperial interest, not out of benevolency, put a stop to it and tell its client regime, not really its client regime, tell its ally, its so-called ally. The United States only follows interests, not allies. But tell its Israeli partner that it feels it's an interest to back off in Gaza. We'll see what happens.
Yep, I guess we'll have to see. So Alex, is there anything that you would like to tell my audience before
if anybody's on Twitter, because I was banned from Facebook 4 years ago.
Shout out to Twitter.
And you can't post politics on Instagram. That's run by Zuckerberg as well.
Yep.
And I call Zuckerberg. He's a sucker for the imperialists. We know that. He's also a Zionist.
Yep.
But find me on Twitter, Alex Suarez. That's my author name as well for the different books that I've written.
Link in the bio.
A case called The Diplomat that's in 3 languages that's been vindicated now that Saab is freed. That came out in 2022. So yeah, you can find me on Twitter or look at my books that way on Amazon.
I want to thank you so much, Alex, for coming on, and definitely you are welcome to come back on the show in the near future. And we could do a panel, whatever. And everybody that's listening, I want to thank everyone for coming out and listening to this great conversation. And I hope that people absorbed a lot of information that Suarez was giving, because it was a lot of great information to give you full understanding on what's going on. And like I said, like I always say, this is a conversation from actual looking into the research and looking at sources that comply with what is reality. This
and
isn't
going
the-
there and going
and
to
going
Venezuela
there.
and going to the courts in Miami for Alex Saab.
Exactly.
When you're there, you really get a sense of what's going on. And the United States imperial government wants to prevent the youth and others from going to these places, from
Right.
knowing about these things with good reason. Because
Right.
once you know the truth, it inspires you to act as you should.
And when you look at my glasses and his glasses, you see no teleprompter.
Hey, you didn't reveal a single question that you were going to give me, and I insisted on that. I said I wanted this to be live. I want to speak from the heart, and,
Right.
and that's what we did, brother.
Yep. So I'm very happy to have this episode with you, and looking many more to talking with you in the future, and hopefully marching with you in DC real soon, brother.
Or maybe come down to Florida. We're trying to plan something.
Oh yeah, I would love to piss DeSantis off.
We call him DeSatan instead of DeSantis. Yeah, I've converted
DeSantis.
to face ones. Yeah, don't get me started on him. We have to do a whole nother show about that.
Oh yes, hell yeah, I would love to sit and talk about that asshole. Well,
All right, brother.
have
Peace.
a really good day, my brother, and everybody out there in the airways. Have a really good day too. And peace and solidarity and free Palestine.